My name is Jared Whitmore. I'm 67 years old, and for the last 4 months I lived in the storage room behind my own garage while my son-in-law used my master bedroom as a home recording studio. I want you to think about that for a second. The room where I slept for 11 years. The room where my wife Carol passed away in her own bed, exactly the way she wanted. That room. With the oak floors she picked out herself and the window that looked out over the backyard where she planted her hydrangeas every spring. He put his guitar equipment in there, his microphone stands, his soundproofing foam. He hung it on the walls right over the paint color Carol and I had chosen together from a little swatch book at the hardware store on a Saturday afternoon in 2009. They had no idea I had already called my attorney. They had no idea that the arrangement we signed, the one my daughter had handed me at the kitchen table with a smile and a pen, the one she told me was just a formality, had a clause buried on page 4 that they never once read, a clause that would change everything. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with the recording studio. It starts with grief. It starts the way most bad decisions do, with a man who just lost his wife and didn't want to be alone in the silence she left behind. Carol died 14 months before any of this happened. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to gone, which the doctors told us was fast. I think they meant it as comfort. It didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a door slamming shut before I even had a chance to look through it one last time. She was 64. We had been married 38 years. I had planned on at least another 20. After she passed, our house in Bend, Oregon felt enormous in a way it never had when there were 2 of us in it. 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a backyard that needed tending. I was a retired civil engineer. I was organized. I was capable. But I walked through those rooms and I felt like I was a ghost, haunting a place that belonged to someone else's life. My daughter Shelby called me every Sunday. She lived in Portland with her husband Preston, and they'd been married 3 years. Preston worked in marketing. Shelby did freelance graphic design. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city. They seemed happy. A little stretched financially maybe, but happy. One Sunday in March, about 6 months after Carol died, Shelby's tone changed. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking. And Preston and I have been talking. We think you should sell the house. You're rattling around in there by yourself. It's too much property for one person. And you could use the liquidity. For retirement. For travel. For enjoying whatever time you have left." That last part landed a little harder than she probably meant it to. Whatever time you have left. I was 66, not 90, but she wasn't wrong that I was lonely, and she wasn't wrong that the house felt too big. So I let her keep talking. "Preston and I found a place," she said. "It's a 4-bedroom in Lake Oswego. Nice neighborhood, good schools if we ever. Well, it has a full ground floor suite, its own bathroom, its own little sitting room, private entrance off the side yard. It would be yours, Dad. Completely yours. We'd all be under one roof. You wouldn't be alone. And we'd stop throwing money away on rent." She had the listing pulled up on her laptop. She showed it to me on a video call. It was a good house. Solid construction. Good bones. The master suite on the ground floor was spacious, well lit, looked out onto a small garden. It reminded me enough of something Carol might have liked that my chest ached when I saw it. Preston got on the screen and said, "We'd really love to have you, Gerald," and I could see on his face that he meant it at the time. I sold the house in Bend in 2 months. It moved fast in that market. I walked away with $890,000 after fees. My retirement accounts held another $340,000. I was not a wealthy man, but I was not a struggling one either. The new house in Lake Oswego listed at $780,000. Shelby and Preston had some savings. About $40,000. They could get approved for a mortgage on the remainder, but it would be tight, very tight. They needed a larger down payment to make the monthly number livable. I put in $320,000. That was my contribution. Not a loan, not formally. It was framed as a gift. A family investment, Shelby called it. "You're not just giving us money, Dad. You're buying into our home, into our family." My attorney at the time was a sharp woman named Patricia Odom. She'd handled Carol's estate and knew our finances well. When I told her what I was planning, she got quiet for a moment. "Gerald," she said carefully, "that's a significant transfer. Are you protected?" "I'm family, Patricia." I said it almost as a reflex. She paused. "That's the part that worries me." We went back and forth. I told her the arrangement was that the ground floor suite was mine, permanent, non-negotiable. That was the one condition I'd put down before I signed anything. Patricia drafted a cohabitation and property rights agreement. She included what she called a protected occupancy clause, standard language that gave me legal right to my designated living space for as long as I chose to remain in the home. She also added a financial contribution addendum that tied my $320,000 to certain property rights, including right of first refusal if they ever decided to sell. Shelby sat at the kitchen table, scanned the document, and signed it without reading past the first page. Preston signed it the same way, quickly, casually, the way you sign a terms and conditions box on a website. Patricia slid copies into an envelope and handed it to me. "Gerald," she said, "I hope you never need this. I moved in on a Thursday in early October. The ground floor suite was everything Shelby had shown me. I put Carol's reading chair by the window. I hung the watercolor we'd bought in Ashland at the Shakespeare Festival 12 years ago. I planted lavender along the side path outside my private entrance because Carol had always said lavender kept a house calm. For about 2 months, things were genuinely fine. Then Preston got serious about the podcast. He'd been doing it as a hobby, recording in the second bedroom on a cheap setup, talking about marketing trends and brand storytelling. It was fine. I never heard it much, but somewhere around December, something shifted. He started talking about going professional, about soundproofing, about equipment, about his audience numbers and his download metrics and a sponsorship opportunity he didn't want to miss. He needed better acoustics, he said. The second bedroom wasn't cutting it. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he brought it up the first time. He sat down across from me at the table and he said, "Gerald, I want to run something by you, and I need you to have an open mind." My suite, he said, had the best natural acoustics in the house. Something about the ceiling height and the position relative to the street noise. He'd done research. He'd consulted an audio engineer, apparently. He needed a dedicated recording space, a professional one. And my room, with its separate entrance, its quiet orientation, its solid walls, was the most practical solution. He wasn't asking me to leave permanently, he said. Just to take one of the upstairs rooms. Just temporarily. Just until he got the business to a point where they could reconfigure. I want you to understand the position I was in. I was 7 months out from losing Carol. I was living in a house I had helped purchase, in a city I'd moved to specifically to be near my daughter. I did not want to make waves. I did not want to be the difficult old man. I did not want my daughter to resent me being there. So I did something I will regret for the rest of my life. I said okay. I told myself it was temporary. I moved my things upstairs to the third bedroom, the smallest one, the one without a closet organizer, the one whose window looked out at the neighbor's fence. I tried to tell myself it was an adjustment, a minor one. Preston moved his equipment in before the weekend. Within 3 weeks, he had installed acoustic foam panels on every wall, including the wall that had Carol's watercolor hanging on it. He took the painting down and left it leaning against the hallway baseboard. He didn't mention it. He didn't ask. He just moved it. I found it there when I came downstairs to get my mail. I put it in my upstairs room and I sat on the edge of the bed and I did not cry. I was past crying. I was somewhere further down that road in a place that felt like a very still, very cold kind of rage. The third bedroom was fine. It was a room. It had a bed and a dresser and a window. But it was not what I had been promised. And the stairs were harder on my left knee than I wanted to admit to anyone. And the bathroom I shared with whoever happened to be staying over. Shelby's college friend had come for a long weekend in November, and I'd had to wait in the hall. Was not the arrangement I had signed on for. And somewhere below my feet every evening, from about 7 p.m. until 11 p.m., I could hear the muffled thump of bass frequencies through the floorboards as Preston recorded. He was not struggling, he was thriving. The sponsorship had come through. He mentioned the number once, not to me but to Shelby, in the kitchen. loudly enough that I heard it from the living room. $12,000, one deal. From a software company that wanted a mid-roll spot on 12 episodes. Good for him. I meant that genuinely, but the math was starting to bother me. If he was making that kind of money from the studio he'd taken over from me, why was I still in the small room upstairs? When did temporary become permanent? When was I going to get back what I had been promised? I brought it up with Shelby one evening when Preston was out. I kept it calm. I said I thought we should talk about the arrangement, about what we'd agreed to. I said I'd been patient. I said I missed my room. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on my daughter's face before. It was not unkind exactly, but it was something close to impatient. Like I was a problem she had been expecting and was tired of dealing with before I'd even finished the sentence. "Dad," she said, "you know how important this is to Preston's career. You know how hard he's been working. The studio isn't going anywhere right now. We really need you to be flexible about this." Flexible. There was that word. I went back upstairs. My knee ached on the third step, the one that always creaked. I sat in my room with Carol's watercolor on the wall across from me, and I thought about the word flexible, and I thought about what I actually owned in this house, and I thought about the document Patricia had prepared. I had not thought about that document in months. I went to my filing box, the old gray one Carol used to tease me about, said I was the only person on earth who still used a physical filing system, and I pulled out the envelope with the Odom Legal Group return address in the corner. I sat on my bed and I read every single page. By the time I got to page 4, my heart was beating differently. The protected occupancy clause was clear. My designated space was the ground floor master suite, described in the addendum with its square footage, its entrance, its bathroom. My right to that space was not conditional. It was not subject to review. It could not be superseded by the preferences of the other occupants without my written notarized consent. I had never given written notarized consent. I had just said okay over a cup of coffee and let a man move sound form into the room where my wife used to sleep. I kept reading. The financial contribution addendum. The right of first refusal clause. And then, near the end, in language Patricia had included almost as an afterthought, the one she'd mentioned briefly when we signed, the one I'd nodded at without fully processing. The enforcement provision. If the protected occupancy clause is violated and the violation is not remedied within 30 days of written notice, the contributing party reserves the right to pursue full recovery of the financial contribution, with interest at 6% per annum from the date of transfer, as a secured lien against the property. I had to read that twice. I could put a lien on the house, a $320,000 lien plus interest, which by now was somewhere around $22,000 on top of that. Against the property they had a mortgage on. Against the property they needed clean title on if they ever wanted to refinance or sell. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days. I did not tell anyone. I just sat with it and let it settle. On the 4th day, I called Patricia. "Gerald," she said, "it's been a while. Is everything all right?" "Not exactly," I said. "I need you to pull the Lakers Regal file." I heard her chair move. I heard the file drawer open. Patricia, unlike most people I'd encountered recently, still had a physical filing system. I had always appreciated that about her. I told her everything, from the studio conversion to the watercolor in the hallway, to the upstairs room to the conversation with Shelby about being flexible. I told her about the knee. I told her about the bass frequencies through the floorboards. I told her I had been in this room for 4 months, and no one had said a word about giving my space back. She listened without interrupting, which is something good attorneys do and rare people do. When I finished, she said, "Gerald, do you understand what they've done? They've violated the clause," I said. "They've violated it completely. And you've been in constructive breach of your own rights for 4 months by not acting on it. But here's the thing. Silence is not consent. Not under this agreement. Your patience doesn't extinguish the violation. We can still act." I asked her what acting looked like. She walked me through it. A formal written notice, served to both Shelby and Preston, citing the specific clause, documenting the violation, and giving them 30 calendar days to remedy it. meaning return the ground floor suite to me in the conditions specified in the agreement. If they failed to comply in 30 days, I could file for the lien. And once that lien was filed and recorded with the county, they would not be able to refinance, sell, or take any equity line on the property without my written release. In a market like Lake Oswego, that was a significant number attached to a significant problem. "Patricia," I said, "don't send anything yet. I need a few more days." She paused. "Gerald, what are you planning?" "I'm an engineer," I told her. "I like to know the full load before I calculate the stress." Here is what I had started to notice in the weeks before I called Patricia. The deliveries. Not groceries, not household items. Boxes from equipment suppliers, from an online retailer that specialized in professional audio gear. Big ones, expensive ones. And twice I had seen Preston on the phone in the backyard, speaking quietly but with the particular intensity of someone negotiating a number. And I had overheard, through the vent in the upstairs hallway that connected in some inexplicable architectural way to the kitchen below, a conversation between Shelby and Preston one evening after dinner. Preston's voice: "If we refinance now, while rates are still where they are, we pull $150,000 in equity out of the property. Clean. We use that to build the proper studio addition on the back, something permanent, real soundproofing, a proper booth. Then the podcast becomes the business and I quit the marketing job." Shelby's voice, quieter, but Dad's contribution: "If we refinance, his attorney's agreement." Preston's voice, cutting her off: "He signed. He's a party to the property. The bank doesn't care about some internal family document. They care about the deed, and his name isn't on the deed." A pause. Shelby again, smaller: "What if he finds out?" Preston: "He's 67 years old and he spends his evenings watching the History Channel. He's not going to find out anything." I stood very still in the upstairs hallway for a long time after that. I thought about the refinance. I thought about what it would mean. They were going to pull equity from a property I had contributed $320,000 to without telling me, to fund a studio expansion in the room that had been guaranteed to me in writing. And my son-in-law, who I had shared a table with for 3 years, who had shaken my hand when I handed them the bank wire confirmation, had just told my daughter that I wouldn't find out because I was old and I watched television in the evenings. I did not sleep well that night. The next morning I got up early. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and when Preston came downstairs in his running clothes, I smiled at him and asked how the podcast was going. He said, "Great, really great, the numbers were climbing." I nodded and said that was wonderful. I told him I was proud of what he built. He looked slightly surprised by that. Just slightly. I asked if he was planning any big changes to the setup. He said maybe down the line, nothing concrete yet. I nodded again. I told him I was thinking of taking a short trip. My old college roommate lived in Scottsdale, Arizona. Haven't seen him in years. Thought I'd drive down, take a week, maybe 2. Preston's face relaxed in a way that was very small and very telling. "Oh," he said, "that sounds great, Gerald. You should do that. Some time away would be good for you." "I'm sure it would," I agreed. I called Patricia that afternoon. I told her I wanted to take a week before serving the notice. I had a reason. She trusted me enough not to push. I drove to Scottsdale, not to see my college roommate who does actually live there, but primarily to put some geographic distance between myself and the situation while I thought clearly. I stayed at a hotel near Old Town. I walked in the mornings. I ate well. I called Patricia every other day. I also, while I was in Arizona, called a real estate attorney she recommended in Portland who specialized in property liens. I wanted to understand exactly what the lien filing process would look like, how long it would take to record, and what the practical effect on a refinancing application would be. The attorney, a calm, methodical man named Garrett, explained it simply. A recorded lien in that amount against that property would appear in any title search. No lender would proceed with the refinance without the lien being resolved. Resolving it would require either paying me out or negotiating a release. Given the market value of the property and the existing mortgage, they did not have the equity to pay me out cleanly and still pursue the studio expansion. In other words, if I filed the lien, their plan stopped. I thanked Garrett. I made a reservation for one more night at the hotel. I ordered room service, a ribeye that was better than I expected, and I sat in the quiet of a room that was not mine and thought about my daughter, not Preston. Shelby. She had heard that conversation. She had raised the concern about my name, about the agreement, about what I might find out, and she had let the conversation move forward anyway. She hadn't called me. She hadn't said anything at Sunday dinner. She had been quiet in the particular way that people are quiet when they've decided to let something happen that they know is wrong. That was the part that hurt. Not the room, not the studio, not Preston's casual dismissal of me as a man who watches the History Channel in the evenings. It was my daughter's silence. 38 years I'd watched her figure out who she was. I'd taught her to parallel park in an empty church lot on a Saturday. I'd sat in the front row when she graduated. I'd walked her down the aisle and shaken Preston's hand at the reception and meant it. And she had decided quietly to let her husband take my money and my room and not say a word. I drove back to Portland on a Friday. I did not go home. I went directly to Patricia's office. We sat across from each other at the small conference table she used for client meetings. She had the file open in front of her. She had the notice drafted. All it needed was my signature and a process server. I read it twice. Then I signed it. Patricia arranged for a process server to deliver the notice on a Monday morning at 9 a.m. when she knew from my description that Preston would be home and Shelby would not yet have left for her desk. I was out there when it happened. I had taken a room at a Marriott in downtown Portland. I had no interest in watching. Patricia called me at 9:37 a.m. "Gerald," she said, "it's been served." I asked if there were any questions. She said Shelby had called the office 11 minutes after service. She was upset. She wanted to know if this was a joke. Patricia told her it was not a joke and suggested they retain their own counsel. My phone started ringing at 10,003. Shelby. I let it go to voicemail. Then Preston. I let that go to voicemail, then Shelby again. Then a number I didn't recognize, which was probably a call from whichever friend or family member they'd reached out to immediately as an intermediary. I sat in my hotel room and I watched the morning move outside the window. Portland was gray and damp, which it tends to be in February. I ordered coffee from room service. It came in a small French press. I found that unexpectedly pleasant. At 12:30, I called Shelby back. She picked up before the first ring had finished. "Dad." Her voice was something I had not heard from her in many years. It was the voice she had at 9 years old when she'd broken the glass bowl Carol's mother had given us and didn't know how to say it. It was not quite crying. It was the state just before crying, held together by effort. "Dad." "What is this?" she said. "What did you send?" "Preston is. Dad, he's talking about lawyers, about fighting this. He says you can't do this. He says you have no standing." I let her finish. "Shelby," I said, "I want to read you something." And I read her the protected occupancy clause, slowly. Every word. The square footage, the bathroom, the private entrance, the explicit description of the space that had been designated as mine. "I need you to tell me," I said when I finished, "what part of that is ambiguous." Silence. "Dad, what part of it, Shelby?" More silence. Then something shifted in her voice. The anger that had been propping her up went soft. And in its place was something I hadn't heard from her since Carol died. Something that was genuine and unguarded and sad. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what it says. I knew in Preston." She stopped. "Go ahead," I said. "When Preston started talking about the refinance," she said carefully, "I told him it was complicated. I told him we should talk to you first." "But you didn't," I said. "No," she said, "I didn't." The line was quiet for a long time. I watched a pigeon land on the hotel windowsill and then leave. "I don't want to fight you," I said. "I want you to understand that. I am not doing this to be cruel to you or to Preston. I am doing this because I was promised something. Because your mother and I spent 40 years understanding that a promise written down is the only promise that holds, and I made sure this one was written down, and it was not honored." "I know, Dad." Her voice was very small. You have 30 days to move the studio equipment out and return my room. That's all I'm asking. I'm not asking for money back. I'm not asking anyone to move out. I'm asking for what was agreed to. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, where are you staying? The Marriott on Broadway, I said. Another pause. Dad. You can come home. My room is full of acoustic foam and a Shure microphone, I said. I'll stay at the Marriott. I spent 2 weeks at the Marriott. They were honestly not bad weeks. I walked along the waterfront in the mornings. I read. I found a diner on Burnside that did an honest plate of eggs and didn't rush you out. I called Patricia every few days. I didn't call Shelby. On the 11th day, Patricia called me. Gerald, she said, Shelby's attorney has been in touch. They want to talk. Their attorney was a young man who specialized in family law and seemed mildly uncomfortable being in the room with Patricia, which told me he understood the weight of what he was looking at. We met in Patricia's conference room, the four of us. Preston was not there, I noted that. Shelby sat across from me in a dark blue sweater, her hands folded on the table. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping. Their attorney presented a proposal. Preston would vacate the ground floor suite within 15 days. He would move his equipment to a storage unit while they explored alternative options for the studio. My original space would be restored. They were asking in exchange that I agree not to file the lien. I looked at Patricia. She looked back at me with the expression of someone who knows better than to say the obvious thing out loud. I looked at Shelby. She met my eyes. That was something. I have one condition, I said. Beyond the room, their attorney leaned forward slightly. I said, I want a new agreement. A proper one, drafted by Patricia, reviewed by your counsel, signed by both of you, notarized, and filed with the county as an attachment to the property record, not a document that sits in an envelope, a document that is part of the permanent record of this property. Shelby's attorney started to say something about the practicality of that. Patricia quietly told him which Oregon statute it fell under. He stopped talking. Shelby said, from across the table, in a voice that was steady, Okay, Dad. Just that. Okay, Dad. Just that. Okay, Dad. I nodded. Then we can resolve this here. Preston moved his equipment out in 14 days. I counted. I was not at the house for most of it, but Patricia confirmed the process to Shelby's attorney. On the 15th day, I drove over with my gray filing box and Carol's watercolor under my arm. The room smelled like acoustic foam and equipment cases. The foam panels had left faint rectangle marks on the walls where they'd been mounted. Preston had done a better job of patching the nail holes than I expected. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Just stood there. The light through the window was the same. The floor was the same. The small door to the side garden was the same. I opened it and looked out at the path where I'd planted the lavender. It had survived the winter. It had survived the winter. It was gray and stubbled down, the way lavender gets in February, but alive. I put Carol's watercolor back on the wall. Same position. I did not need to measure. I knew exactly where it went. I went and sat in her reading chair, which I'd moved back down that morning, and I looked out the window at the garden, and I stayed there for a while. Things with Shelby did not go back to normal immediately. I didn't expect them to. We were careful with each other, the way you're careful with the place where something broken has been repaired, but you're not yet sure how well. Preston was quieter around me. Not hostile, just quieter. He moved his podcast setup to a converted corner of the basement and bought additional soundproofing materials out of his own sponsorship money. He did not ask me how it sounded. I did not offer an opinion. About 6 weeks after I moved back in, Shelby knocked on my door one evening. I was reading. She had 2 cups of tea. She came in and sat on the end of the reading chair's ottoman, which is the way she used to sit when she was a teenager and wanted to talk to her mother. She didn't apologize directly, not in the way that has specific words and a specific form, but she told me that the night before the papers were served, she had almost called me. She had stood in the kitchen after Preston was asleep, holding her phone, and almost called. Why didn't you? I asked. Because I didn't know how to say it without it becoming a war, she said. I thought maybe it would resolve itself. I thought maybe I could talk Preston around to doing the right thing without you having to know how close it had gotten to the wrong thing. I held my tea with both hands. I looked at her. "You should have called," I said. "I know," she said. "I know that now." We sat there for a while. It was quiet in the way that the house used to be quiet. The way it was in the first few weeks, before the bass frequencies and the equipment cases and the document in the hallway. "I want to tell you something," I said. She looked at me. "Your mother used to say that trust is not the same as faith. Faith is what you give someone before they've earned it. Trust is what you rebuild, carefully, after something breaks." She said you can love someone completely and still need to rebuild the trust. Shelby's eyes got wet. She didn't say anything. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her. "This is my home. I contributed to it. I live here, and I intend to keep living here. But we do it with honesty, with documents if that's what honesty requires, and we do it as family." She nodded. She wiped her eye with the sleeve of her sweater. We drank our tea. We talked for an hour, not about the room or the lean or Preston's podcast or any of it. We talked about Carol, about the lavender outside, about a trip Shelby remembered when she was 12 and we'd driven to Crater Lake and I had refused to admit I was lost for 45 minutes even though I very clearly was. She laughed at that. The real kind. When she left, I sat alone for a while. I looked at the watercolor on the wall, the one from Ashland. Carol and I in our early 40s, wandering into that small gallery on a Saturday afternoon with no plan. She had pointed to it immediately. I remember thinking it was too expensive. I remember her looking at me with the particular patience she had when she knew I was wrong about something. She was right, of course. She usually was. Here is what I know now that I did not know before. Grief makes you want to believe the best of people. It makes you want to lean in, say yes, keep the peace, not be the difficult one. You just lost your foundation and you will do almost anything to feel like you still have walls around you. That vulnerability is real, and it is something people, even people who love you, will take advantage of without fully understanding that they're doing it. I signed that document with Patricia because I have spent 38 years with a woman who understood that love and legal protection are not opposites. She was the one who made us write down everything important. Wills, healthcare directives, property arrangements. She used to say, if you can't put it in writing, you don't trust it. And if you don't trust it, that's information. The document I signed with Shelby and Preston was not a sign of distrust. It was a sign of respect for the relationship, for what we were building together. They just forgot to read it. I'm not going to tell you the whole thing was worth it. I won't pretend that 4 months upstairs with a bad knee and my wife's painting in the hallway was some kind of necessary trial. It wasn't. It was avoidable. It was fixable. It required one honest conversation that no one was willing to have. But here is what I will say. The lavender came back. It always comes back if the roots are deep enough. I sat on my garden bench the other morning. My bench, outside my door, in front of my lavender, with my coffee and the early March light coming flat and pale over the fence. And Shelby came outside and sat next to me without saying anything. And we watched the neighborhood wake up. And that was enough, for now. That was enough. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what the honest version of the lesson is, not the clean version, not the one that wraps up neatly with a bow, the honest one. Here it is. What happened to me did not happen because Preston was a uniquely terrible person. It happened because I made it easy. I walked into that house with $320,000 and a grief so heavy I couldn't think straight, and I handed both of them the money and my vulnerability without making sure anyone understood what was actually being agreed to. I said okay when I should have said, let me think about it. I moved upstairs when I should have said, read the document you signed. I spent 4 months sleeping badly and saying nothing because I was afraid of becoming the difficult father. The one who causes problems, the one who sours the relationship. That fear is what cost me those 4 months. Not Preston's ambition, not Shelby's silence, my own willingness to disappear quietly rather than hold the line I had every right to hold. Carol understood something about that. She understood it better than I did for most of our marriage. She used to say that avoiding conflict is not the same as keeping the peace. You can avoid a conversation for years and call it harmony, but what you're actually doing is building pressure behind a wall that will eventually give. She wasn't a confrontational woman. She was just honest. She knew the difference between the two. The document Patricia drafted was Carol's idea, in a way, not literally. Carol had been gone 6 months by then, but it came from 38 years of watching her insist that important things be written down. Wills, directives, property agreements. She didn't do it because she didn't trust people. She did it because she respected relationships enough to protect them from the version of themselves that shows up under pressure. What I understand now is that integrity doesn't just mean well. It means following through on what you committed to, even when it becomes inconvenient, even when the other party has stopped paying attention to what they agreed to. Preston signed that document without reading it. That was his failure. But the clause existed because I had been deliberate enough to insist on it when I was thinking clearly. That earlier version of me, the one sitting in Patricia's office asking questions, protected the later version of me, the one sitting in a cramped upstairs room, listening to bass frequencies through the floor. Resilience, I think, is not the same as toughness. It's not gritting your teeth and enduring. It's having the patience to wait until you understand the full situation before you act, and then acting with everything you have. I did not fire off an angry letter the night I overheard Preston talking about the refinance. I drove to Arizona. I walked. I thought. I ate a good steak in a quiet hotel room, and I let the anger pass through me until what was left was clarity. That clarity was the thing that won. Not rage. Not retaliation. Just the clear, steady knowledge of what had been agreed to and the willingness to hold it. Shelby and I are rebuilding. It is slow. It is not dramatic. Some morning she brings 2 cups of tea to my door and we sit without saying much. That is enough for now. Trust, as her mother used to say, is not faith. It is something you build a little at a time after the break with your hands. The lavender is coming back. The roots were deep enough. That, I think, is the whole of it.